This is The Zero Hour with RJ Eskow, produced by the We Act Radio Network in Washington, D.C., and broadcast across the nation. Visit us online at thisisthezerohour.com or at youtube.com/thezerohour. Ladies and gentlemen, RJ Eskow.
Well, it's been an exciting week. Welcome back to the Zero Hour. There's been a lot going on. There's crisis in the Ukraine. There is a crisis in Syria. There is ongoing tension in Ferguson. There is an ongoing slow motion catastrophe in the economy. There is much that needs to be done to set the world aright. And remember, that's why we're called the Zero Hour. The time is now. We've got a great show coming up for you. We've got Robert Borisage of the Institute for America's Future talking about inequality and what can be done about it. We'll be talking about technology and how it's affecting the lives of workers on the railways. And it makes a great story, not only for railroad workers, but as an example of what we all face. We've got a number of other topics coming up for you. Please stick around. We've got a good show. And before we get started, another issue that's gotten big this week is Burger King. As we wrote recently, it looks as if the subjects of the Burger King out there in Burger King land are royally pissed off. You know, Leo Tolstoy wrote in War and Peace that kings are the slaves of history. And when the king in question depends on the patronage of happy customers who want to eat its meals, that monarchy is also a slave to public opinion. If social media is any indicator, public opinion is not feeling very good about Burger King right now. In fact, we've been looking at the Facebook page for Burger King, which features the rather unfortunate slogan now, chicken fries are back. I wonder if that means as in to chicken to pay your taxes, because as a lot of people know, Burger King is merging with a Canadian company and has every plan in mind to become Canadian, even though it's American in origin, even though most of its revenue would still come from the United States. There's a big company in Canada, but most of the revenue would still be American. They want to move to Canada, which would exempt them from having to pay tax on international income or the back money that they've owed on that international income. Interesting move on their part. The company they're purchasing, Tim Hortons, is a donut shop. It's known most of all for its coffee. Here, I'll take a sip right now. Man, that's good coffee. Okay, Tim Hortons, good coffee. Okay, we certainly need a competitor to Starbucks in the country, and maybe they'd bring it here. But still, it's tax evasion is tax evasion. So when they put up something, I think, they post little sales things. Lunch, brunch, same difference was one of their posts. And someone a veteran wrote in to his senator in the comments section saying, I encourage you to sponsor a bill that, as a veteran, the person said, I encourage you to sponsor a bill that shuts down every single Burger King located on an American military installation in the U.S. There were all sorts of other anti-Burger King comments. On another post, which advised, be the chicken fries you want to be, which is odd messaging when you think about it. I like to eat food. I don't like to become the food, although they say you are what you eat. One comment said, I love the chicken fries, but not from some traitorous tax-dodging company. Hello, Wendy's. Okay, so someone else wrote, Burger King's ingredients are trucked in on taxpayer-funded roads. Its meat is made safe by taxpayer-funded inspectors. Burger King's workers are paid so little that taxpayer-funded social safety net programs have to pick up the slack. And in return for that, Burger King won't even pay the corporate tax rate. That's getting it exactly right. Finally, Burger King responded and said, well, we'll still pay our American taxes, but not as an American corporation. That's a big difference. So they're kind of sliding around the fact there. We will maintain our longstanding commitment to our employees, franchisees, and the local communities we serve. Their statement concludes, the Whopper isn't going anywhere. Boy, they were right about that, I guess, because there were several Whoppers in that statement. They're going to be evading those back taxes we told you about. And by the way, American taxes for corporations are not high when compared to other corporations. The official tax rate looks high, but there are so many loopholes in there that what they actually pay is on the low end. And not only that, corporate profits overall are at record high, even for Burger King. Burger King 2013 results led the Wall Street Journal to run the headline, Burger King profit rises on lower costs. Their profit went up nearly 40% that year. Its performance in the first quarter of this year led USA Today to proclaim in a headline that, quote, Burger King cuts costs serves up tasty profits. And yet here they are going off to leave the country that made them successful. You know, they were founded in 1953 in Jacksonville, Florida. They were not founded in Canada or anywhere else. So there's a petition drive against Burger King. You can look it up at the Campaign for America's Future and Americans for Tax Fairness, and people are still writing those comments on the Burger King page. Burger King crowned king of the tax dodgers, someone writes. Boycott. Someone else writes, if you move, I will unfortunately never be able to eat at any Burger King anywhere. Well, I don't know how unfortunate it is health-wise. Even Joe Scarborough, the conservative, said, I think a lot of Americans should not go to Burger King again if they're going to cheat on taxes. And another guy on his show said, their fries suck. And Joe said they do suck. So I think right now investors should be saying to their king of burgers, turn back, sire, before it's too late, because this is going to hurt them. Otherwise, that informal boycott seems to have started already. If Burger King wants a fight with the American people, well, you know how the American people are. They're likely to say to it, have it your way. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour. And we are back on the Zero Hour. You know, this weekend is Labor Day, as you've no doubt noticed. And here to talk to us about a subject integral to the Labor Day topic is Robert L. Borisage. He's the founder and president of the Institute for America's Future and co-director of its sister organization, the Campaign for America's Future, with which I am affiliated. These two organizations were launched by 100 prominent Americans to develop the policies, message, and issue campaigns that help forge an enduring majority for progressive change in America. Bob, thanks for joining us.
Got to unmute first. My pleasure. Good to be here.
Absolutely. Yes, please. We need to unmute the left. That's our mission here.
Exactly.
So now you've written a new study, and you wrote up a blog post about it, and you said that you pointed out that here we are paying tribute to Labor Day, but working family incomes haven't gone up in the 21st century. Inequality is reaching new extremes. Corporate profits are reaping a record portion of the nation's income. This is you, of course, while workers' wages wallow at record lows. So we should do more than celebrate workers. We should understand how vital reviving worker unions are to building reviving a broad middle class. Why is that? What is the relationship between unions and the middle class in your thinking?
Well, that's the thing that's fascinating about this debate we've been having about the declining middle class and the rise of extreme inequality, which is almost the entire mainstream dialogue around it omits the kind of motor force, or at least one of the major engines of building the middle class in the first place, which were very powerful unions, workers organized into unions who could demand and get decent pay and begin to create the structure of benefits, pensions, and health care that were the centerpiece of building a broad middle class. And what's happened is when we were building that middle class and coming out of World War II for 3 decades, unions were very strong, and workers shared in the productivity and profits they helped to create, and the society grew together. That is, incomes on the bottom and the middle rose as fast as incomes on the top. But the success of unions, not their failure, led corporations and the right to launch fierce attacks on them. And over time, unions have become dramatically weaker. So now they represent less than 7% of the private workforce. They're basically not a factor. And corporations have created strategies with globalization and tax and trade strategies that put workers in competition with low-wage workers around the world. They've perfected ways of trampling the right of workers to organize and effectively eliminated the right to organize in this society. And the result is you can see in what's happened to the middle class. That is, productivity still goes up, profit still goes up, but workers don't share in them. And in fact, middle class, as I said, household incomes haven't increased in the 21st century over the last 14 years. And corporate profits now are a record share of national income, whereas workers' wages are a record low share. And this is because, I think, in significant degree of the weakness of the success of the campaign to destroy the empowering of workers through unions. And
well, let's talk about that for a second. If I could just jump in. We're talking with Robert Borisage, the Institute for America's Future, about unions and the middle class. Now, there's been a very, as you know, multi-decade comprehensive campaign against war against unions waged on multiple fronts, including in the political debate. And one of the things they will tell you, let's say the other side of the corporate side of this debate, is that the shift is not due to the weakening of workers, but rather to what they seem to describe as irresistible or inexorable forces. For example, globalization was inevitable, and technological change was inevitable, and they talk about structural unemployment, and they say that basically their argument seems to be the workers just aren't as important to the economy as they used to be, and the union business, that's causality, getting causality wrong. They don't have power, so they don't need unions anymore because they got nothing to bargain with. What do you say to that?
Well, I think that's the mainstream dialogue, really, or narrative about how the economy changed. And the problem with it is that it's like the dog that didn't bark in the Sherlock Holmes story. It leaves out the whole question of politics and power. So, technological change was taking place when the middle class was getting built after World War II. And globalization isn't an act of nature. It's a set of policies, tax, trade, financial, monetary policies, where you make choices, and those choices benefit parts of the economy and they injure others. We made choices. Multinationals basically wrote our globalization strategy, and they chose to benefit investors, made it easy to ship jobs abroad, made it even easier to threaten to move jobs abroad, and dramatically weakened the ability of workers here at home. But that was a choice. In Germany, they made a very different choice where unions were stronger, and the companies and the unions together navigated a globalization strategy that has made Germany one of the great export powers of the world and allows German workers to sustain middle-class incomes and benefits.
So your point, among other things, being that Germany, which has these policies more favorable to workers, exists in the same planet and the same economic forces that we do. If they can do it, we can do it. We chose not to. You mentioned the Sherlock Holmes story about the dog that didn't bark. I'm not sure if I remember that story correctly. The dog didn't bark because it was his master coming in. And that gets to the question of the two political parties and corporations. And, we haven't heard a lot of barking, some of us might say, on behalf of the unions and working people in general in Washington, as we might like. And this gets to the issue of corporate influence in politics. Who are the politicians out there who are really making the argument and backing it up with action on behalf of American workers and unions? Before we get back to the union topic, which I do want to do.
Well, rhetorically, nothing's happening at the national level because it's just locked up by Republican obstruction. But there's no question that Sherrod Brown, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, the Congressional Progressive Caucus in the House, Keith Ellison, Raul Grijalva, and others have been very articulate and forceful advocates for empowering workers at the workplace. What's more interesting in some ways, because things can move, is at the state and local level. So, for example, in Los Angeles, elected officials in the city council passed laws that use the procurement and zoning powers of the city to force contractors to allow workers to organize in their workplace and to adhere to labor laws. And that made a big difference in the ability of a strong union movement to get even stronger in Los Angeles and to start to begin to create middle-class benefits, et cetera. And that's the other point that's so striking in this. People have a sense, the jobs have changed. We've got all this contingent labor and part-time jobs, and we've moved from an industrial economy to a economy of services, and service jobs don't pay well, and and this is just sort of inevitable. But the reality is no job is inherently marginal. That is simply a question of definition and a question of power. So, for example, in Phoenix, if you're a hotel maid, you make the minimum wage at best, and you're at great risk of having a lot of those wages and certainly your overtime stolen by your employers. You have no union. In New York City, where unions represent the workers who are hotel maids, you can earn $50,000 a year, you get health benefits, you get a pension, and you get regular hours because you have a strong union negotiating at your side. So these things, the strength of unions makes a huge difference. And the corporations get that. That's why they've led the war on them. The right wing gets it at the national level because they know unions have been central when they were strong to all of the reforms that helped raise the minimum wage, protect Social Security, create Medicare, et cetera, that helped working people. So they went after them as a pillar of the Democratic Party. It seems, and the only people who don't get it to some degree are kind of conservative Democrats or new Democrats who decided it was fashionable that unions were outmoded and not necessary to the new economy.
Well, but that seems to be part of the dialogue now. So I think, and I certainly agree with the great figures, the inspiring figures you mentioned at the national level and certainly the local level. But at the national, let's say at the presidential level, we don't hear a lot of talk about, I go back to the 1956 Republican platform where Eisenhower boasted about the number of union jobs he'd created and the number of people he'd put on the Social Security rolls in his first term. Now you don't really even hear Democrats giving a full-throated presidential level endorsement of unions. Does that mean, to get back to your point, that a lot of the action is going to be at the state and local level now, you think?
Well, I think inevitably the action is going to be at the state and local level for a while simply because Washington is dysfunctional and the obstruction of the Tea Party right has really locked up the Congress from doing anything. The president on his own in his ability to operate with executive orders has done some things. So he issued an executive order that gave contract workers a $10.10 minimum wage, one that they wouldn't pass through the Congress for most workers. He just issued an executive order giving procurement advantage to companies that haven't violated labor laws and haven't been convicted of trampling the rights of their workers. And so he's begun, at least, to make some steps with his own pen that can help move this forward. And I think one of the things we've got to be demanding as progressives is, one, that unions get put back into the progressive agenda, and two, that where we control government bodies, 28 out of the 30 biggest cities are controlled by Democrats, that they start using the power of government to help empower workers to organize at the workplace. At the end of World War II, when unions grew, they grew because government policy helped them to grow under Roosevelt. And they were undermined by government policy under Reagan, Bush's, and the New Dems. And it's going to take government policy, it seems to me, to help workers come back and to be able to organize once again.
And if you can stick with us, Robert Borisaj, through this break and maybe talk to us a little more, I want to maybe talk about a plan of action to make that happen and how we might get there from here. So if you can stick with us, then we'll take a quick break and be right back after this and continue this discussion on the role of unions and ending inequality, reducing inequality and restoring the middle class. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour. And we are back on the Zero Hour. We are talking with Robert L. Borisaj, founder and president of the Institute for America's Future and co-director of the Campaign for America's Future, about the campaign's new study on inequality and the role of unions in reducing it and restoring the middle class. So, Bob, before we went away, you had mentioned a couple victories that I thought were really important and interesting as we think about kind of how to change the dynamic here that's been decimating the middle class, and in a related or causal move decimating the union movement. And that is, one of them was the two presidential executive orders, which helped workers significantly. And I think in both cases, we had on the show Joseph Georgesi, who's a worker activist who worked very closely with the Congressional Progressive Caucus. We had Representative Keith Ellison on with Joseph to talk about those executive orders. So I think, one of the lessons at the presidential level there was, if you have a president that can be touched by the constituency of working people and unions and so on, that really workers need to organize and find political alliances and politicians in the electoral system that can work with them. And I think Los Angeles was a similar story. You mentioned the new developments in Los Angeles. Wasn't worker organization an element, essential element of that as well?
No question, and a lot of it coming from new immigrant workers who were eager to gain, put together unions and be active politically.
And you mentioned the new population, the new immigrant workers. This is another interesting area. I mean, as we all look at the union movement and kind of study it, there's a popular misconception, I think, probably almost certainly part of this misinformation campaign on the part of corporations, that somehow unions are moribund, they're overly bureaucratic, they're not really thinking in new ways, and they're part of this is a new democratic thing, a new Dem centrist thing too. Oh, that's part of the old way. But the fact is, the more we've had Richard Trumka on the show, we've had other union organizers on the show. We're going to have a railroad general secretary of a railroad union, more of a confederation on right after this segment. It seems to me that the union movement is actually being very imaginative, and I'll give it credit, a lot of credit, but I'm interested in your thoughts, for reaching out to people like immigrants, home workers, and other people who are not members of union now, minimum wage workers, are supporting those for example, at fast food restaurants who rose up and asked for an increase in pay and so on. So isn't an essential part of this strategy, if progressives want to help restore the union movement in order to restore the middle class, isn't an essential part of it sort of educating ourselves about those efforts and supporting them?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think another part is a lot of experimentation. I mean, we've got to find different ways of organizing workers. Unions have to experiment with different ways of reaching out. You've got things like the Restaurant Opportunity Center, which has begun to represent women who work as waiters and waitresses in restaurants, who get paid a minimum wage that's I can't remember, $2.75 or some preposterous notion, and has started to do minimum wage drives that would apply to those kinds of workers, not exclude them from when the minimum wage gets lifted. And I think there's going to be, it's very hard to turn this around. And it's going to take a lot of experimentation to do that. The thing that's fascinating, though, is even though unions are almost non-existent in the workforce, 7% is pretty low, it's close to zero in the private workforce. Workers, if they had the right to organize without getting trampled by employers, would organize. That is, they understand the need to have a collective voice at the workplace, to stand up for them simply in terms of whether they can get regular hours out of an employer, or whether they can keep their wages from overtime from being stolen, whether they can enforce safety regulations that are nationally laws but don't get enforced or get ignored by employers. They understand instinctively the need and the importance of having representation. And our problem as a country is we've basically allowed corporations to systematically destroy the ability of workers to organize by trampling the rights that they, in theory, have in law.
Well, and that gets to, I guess, what my final topic is I just wanted to briefly explore with you, which is, the South American educator used to write about internalizing the oppressor consciousness, how people just get fall into despair and just assume that the person who's keeping them down is right and they're wrong, And that takes many forms, but it seems to me in the union movement, or in the movement that should be leading to worker organization, there's this sense that, well, we don't really have any power, we can't make a difference, or even worse, that somehow the dialogue has shifted to the idea that what's really hurting our economy is the worker who gets a decent pension, or the bus driver who makes a decent living wage, that somehow those are the guys we've got to go at, the men and women we've got to go after, rather than the excessive accumulation of wealth at the top 0.01%, or in corporate safes or whatever. Any thoughts on how to shift that political and sort of cultural dialogue towards something more optimistic and, but I would argue, more realistic?
Well, I think some of that started to shift already. That is, Occupy in many ways transformed that and challenged that debate and that perspective. And it put on the table the fact that the 1% was not only collecting all the income and wealth of the society, but they had rigged the rules so that they benefited them and not the rest of us. And I think that has begun a debate that has reached pretty far, remarkably far into the society, about this notion that the few are rigging the game with money and with their influence, and have got to be stopped. The harder question, I think, now is: are people hopeful? Are they hopeful enough that it's possible that they start to experiment with ways to challenge? And I think we've seen the beginnings of that with the fast food walkouts. We've seen the beginnings of that with the different kinds of strikes of federal workers demanding a decent wage, and some of that is simply people pushed to the limit, and so they have no choice but to demonstrate. And some of it is an increasing sense that this is just not fair, not right, and that they've got to stand up and protest it. And hopefully we have to spread that spirit, and then we have to elevate the examples of where workers have in fact been able to make a difference. So the Seattle, $15 minimum wage, the what's happened in Los Angeles and San Francisco with building labor codes that actually help workers gain living wages. This is all stuff that's just beginning, but that if we can keep having victories at the local level and advertising them across the country, can begin to counter this sense of despair.
And I think your report goes a long way toward addressing that too, and providing some theoretical background at least for that. So where can people go to read it?
Go to our website, ourfuture.org, www.ourfuture.org. It's right on the front page, and we hope people will use it, spread it around, make sure that lots of people talk about it and read about it. This ought to be a drumbeat, and we ought to make sure that any progressive, any reformer, as a first order of business, includes rebuilding the right of workers to organize and bargain collectively as the centerpiece of their reform agenda.
All right. Well, Robert L. Borisage, Director of the Institute for America's Future, Co-Director of Campaign for America's Future, thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
We'll be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour. And we are back on the Zero Hour. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and ever since they first laid rails and started running trains, kids have dreamed of joining the railroad. And a lot of Americans, people around the world, may have one idea about what it's like to work trains nowadays, what's going on in the world of a train worker. But here to enlighten all of us is our next guest. Ron Kaminkow is General Secretary of the group Railroad Workers United, which is a cross-craft network of railroad workers from all crafts carriers and rail unions across North America. Ron is also currently working as a locomotive engineer on an Amtrak passenger service, and he's worked as an engineer, brakeman, conductor on a number of different railroad lines. He's here with us now to talk about some of their latest issues and struggles. Ron, thanks so much for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me, RJ.
You bet. Now, listen, first, did I pronounce your last name right?
It's Cam&Co.
Cam&Co. Okay, all right. Thank you for the correction. You know, mine is Eskow. You'd be amazed how many people get it wrong. Eskow. It's phonetic, but they get it wrong. So I'm glad I asked. Cam&Co. Ron Cam&Co. And listen, Ron. So you guys, I've been reading up on you guys, Railroad Workers United, and what struck me first, and I've been reading your your official publication, the Highball, and you got a couple big fights, but one of the biggest fights I think you guys are working on now is this idea of the single employee train crew, and this seems to be a big and ongoing battle for you. Is that right? And if so, could you tell us a little bit about it?
That's right. We've actually been engaged in this fight for almost getting on a decade now. It was in November of 2004 that the major rail carriers in the United States basically played their hand and made it very clear that they intended to run trains with a single employee. As little as a few generations ago, train crews typically were 5 and even 6 crew members. That was pared down through the implementation of new technology, the elimination of the caboose in the 1980s and so forth, until the 90s when we were basically left with just the engineer and the conductor as the 2 employees on through freight. And then, like I say, in the fall of 2004, the rail carriers decided, well, we're going to push in contract negotiations to eliminate one of those positions and then just simply have trains run with 1 employee. And so at that time, in the spring of 2005, a group called Railroad Operating Crafts United got started. Our goal was to unite the conductors union and the engineers union to make it impossible for the rail carriers to play one union and one craft off against the other. That organization morphed into RWU in 2008, and this has been one of our pet projects ever since our origin.
So you're still fighting this battle now. Are they talking about doing this for all kinds of trains, passenger as well as freight?
It remains to be seen. I think the ultimate goal of the rail industry would be to run trains with absolutely nobody on board, and they believe that this would be quite possible through what's known as positive train control, satellite operation of trains, and so forth. As you're aware, in the rail industry, we once had 2 million employees, and that is pared down to under 200,000 today. We're actually moving a lot more tonnage than we ever have with far fewer employees. In fact, U.S. railroaders are known as the most efficient railroaders on the face of the planet in terms of what they call I believe the expression is man-ton miles, which is to say an employee moves a ton of freight a mile most efficiently in terms of less labor power. And of course, the carriers are going for less. It remains to be seen. Now, if you like, I'll talk about the tentative agreement in the context of the Burlington Northern Santa Fe and the SMART Union, which is kind of...
Sure, tell us about that.
Okay, the reason I want to switch over to that is because the BNSF, which is owned by Warren Buffett, it's a Berkshire Hathaway company. About 5 or 6 years ago, Berkshire Hathaway bought out the Burlington Northern Santa Fe, the second largest freight railroad in the United States. They bought it out in its entirety, and they are the railroad that seems to be spearheading the drive for single-employee train crews. Now, when pressed, their PR frontman will say, oh, no, we're not going to operate oil trains with a single employee because they know there'd be a huge public outcry. But in the tentative contract agreement with the union that we are dead set opposed to, nowhere in that tentative agreement does it say anything about accepting oil trains, passenger trains, other trains laden with toxic materials, hazardous material. There's nothing in the contract. So our assumption is once the whole thing blows over, if in fact BNSF ever is allowed to commence running trains with a single employee, if there's no federal regulation and no federal law and no union contract that prohibit it, then they would probably, in all likelihood, begin to run oil trains and everything else with a single employee.
You know what else strikes me about that deal is that, or about that issue, is that if they're saying that, if they're even claiming that they wouldn't run those trains with hazardous materials on them, aren't they acknowledging that it's dangerous to run a train with only one employee on it?
You would have to ask them that question. Our take is that it is extremely dangerous to run these trains, to run any train with a single employee. There has been made some mention of the fact that Amtrak and some commuter railroads operate with a single engineer in the cab of the locomotive. And while this may be true, that engineer has a conductor and an assistant conductor to provide effective support as the train goes down the track, reminding the engineer of impending speed restrictions or other hazards that may come along the right of way. If there is any kind of emergency, if the train were to have an encounter at a railroad grade crossing with a truck or a car, a pedestrian, and a fatality or injury were to result, that engineer has two qualified and certified co-workers to resort to. On freight trains, the proposal is to have none of this. The engineer would be completely on his own or her own. Trains traverse territory that is often very, very remote and skirts the edges of wilderness areas in places like Colorado and Montana. Remote canyons, goes through long tunnels over high trestles in very, very remote locations. And if and when any kind of derailment, crossing, collision were to occur, or any other type of medical emergency, there would be nobody potentially for miles and miles to lend assistance. That's just the tip of the iceberg. Written articles recently explaining dozens and dozens of similar hazards that would result if we simply ran trains with a single employee crew. For example, railroad workers are generally on call. We have no set schedules in the freight industry. Railroad workers by law can be forced to work up to 12 hours at a time. This is incredibly routine for workers to work at night, through the night, 12 hours. Imagine with no assistance every day, day after day, week after week. One day you're up all night, then you sleep in the daytime. We go to work at all kinds of hours. You never know when that phone's going to ring. You never know when you're going to work. You don't know when you'll arrive at your away-from-home terminal. You have no idea how long you'll be at the away-from-home terminal, and you have no idea when you're going to be called to come home and how long that tour of duty will last.
And now they're telling you to spend those extended hours in basically complete human isolation.
Yeah, absolutely. And that brings us to other hazards. Just the sheer fact of, in general, railroaders historically work for the railroad throughout their career. We have lots of guys who have worked for the railroad for 20, 30, 40 years. If that's going to continue, I can't imagine the young generation spending their entire working life in total isolation in a locomotive cab, which is about, I've never measured one, but it's probably about 10 by 10 feet. About the size of an old, cheap, single-room occupancy hotel room. You're in a very small quarters. You're isolated from just about everybody, and this is how you would spend your career year after year, decade after decade. I don't believe that's a good way for anybody to go to work.
No, I couldn't agree with you more, and we're going to have to leave it there for now, but where can people go to find out more about the work you guys are doing?
Probably the easiest way would be to go to our website. It's www.railroadworkersunited.org. And at that website, you can make contact with us. You can join the organization. You can basically peruse all of the information we have, a series of different campaigns we're involved in, including this one, with lots and lots and lots of documentation. Right now on our homepage is all of the information about what's going on the BNSF right now.
Okay, well, we encourage people to do that. The railroads affect us all, and thank you so much for joining us, Ron Kamenko, current General Secretary of the group Railroad Workers United. You guys do great work, and thanks for joining us.
All right, thank you. I appreciate you having us on.
You bet. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and we will be back after this on the Zero Hour. Hello, everybody. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is time for your end of the week 0 hour news wrap up. Well, the big headline stories for the week, and I'm holding the Friday editions of the New York Times and the Los Angeles Times right in front of me right now. New York Times headline: Obama urges calm in face of two crises, volatile situations in Syria and Ukraine. And of course, as we know, also in Iraq. We saw the tragic beheading of a journalist. We saw the freeing of another journalist by a group, an al-Qaeda-related group, who now appears moderate because the ISIS group is so extreme. And the New York Times reports that with tensions rising in Europe and the Middle East, Mr. Obama emphasized that a military response would not resolve either situation and pledged to build international coalitions to grapple with them. You know, these are good words. And one of the things that strikes me in the progressive debate, for example, about how to handle the ISIS situation, is that it's constantly framed in the following terms. It's framed in terms of either we do nothing, except perhaps a little humanitarian relief, and look the other way as the tragedies continue, or we intervene unilaterally and militarily by bombing ISIS positions in Iraq and presumably Syria. Now, the problem with that is that we seem to have forgotten, even many of us on the left, the role of international diplomacy. We're going to be talking about that a little more later in the show, I believe, but the role of multilateral action, the role of saying whether it is Ukraine or Syria, that the way, and of course, as you probably know, Russia is intruding itself even more militarily into the Ukraine situation. There's a belief that it is trying to build what is called a land bridge through Crimea to the ocean. So the question then becomes, to what extent there's this myth of America as the lone cowboy striding the world stage and determining who will wrestle with and who will let go. It sounds to me like it's time for some international diplomacy. Now, related story is Ebola gripped city, quarantine adds to chaos. There are far more new Ebola stories than people anticipated there being. That is a concern. They now say, the World Health Organization now says that the accelerating epidemic could afflict 20,000 people. Now, it's a humanitarian concern, but the notion that Americans have to be terrified that they're going to catch Ebola is absolutely silly. They should be far more concerned at this point about everyday health concerns, diet, weight, cancer, the carcinogens in the atmosphere, risks at work. Far more Americans will die this year at work than anybody will die globally from Ebola. So we should be struggling for a safe workplace. We should be struggling for a carcinogen-free environment. We should be struggling to provide food security to lower income households. Yes, Ebola is horrifying. Yes, these deaths are tragic. Yes, we should do everything we can to step in, but that does not mean we should succumb to panic. Panic only serves to distract us from those situations we are most able to change and that are far more likely to affect us personally. Another story in the New York Times, Pieline, Milwaukee, evictions soar in hot market, renters suffer. We hear a lot about foreclosures. We've covered the foreclosure crisis a lot in this country, but as the renters market has soared, people are getting tossed out of their homes in the renters world as well. Part of that has to do with ongoing crises in employment, in unemployment, underemployment rather, where people are unable to find full-time work, and wage stagnation, and a minimum wage that is far too low. We should be concerned about these evictions in the renters market, and again, they point us to the need to reunify our economy. New York City is expanding pre-K programs. That was the subject of a bitter fight between the progressive mayor of New York City, Bill de Blasio, and the new Democratic, that is to say, corporate Democratic shill, Andrew Cuomo, the despicable governor of the state of New York. But I won't say more lest I tip my hands on my opinion about Governor Cuomo. And by the way, for those of you listening from the great state of New York, if you are Democrats, the primary is on September 9th. You might be very well served and be doing a favor for your state if you were to vote for Mr. Cuomo's opponents, Zephyr Teachout and Timothy Wu, for the positions of governor and lieutenant governor, respectively. And we will close with that, except to say that after this brief break, we will be back with some even more direct editorial comments, opening monologue, and then our guests for this hour. Stick around. I think you'll enjoy it. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.
This is The Zero Hour with RJ Eskow, produced by the WeAct Radio Network in Washington, D.C., and broadcast across the nation. Visit us online at thisisthezerohour.com or at youtube.com/thezerohour. Ladies and gentlemen, RJ Eskow.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to The Zero Hour. And this hour, we have a great discussion set up with Dr. Lynn Paramore, who has written on everything since we've last had her on. She's written on everything from economics to having sex with robots, and you can bet also the idea of temporary marriages. So we will be having a wide-ranging conversation with our friend, Dr. Lynn Paramore, and our other friend, Ryan Grimm, Washington Bureau Chief for the Huffington Post, talking about net neutrality. So we've got a lot to talk about in this hour, but first, a little bit of economic news for you. A great stock market milestone was reached this week. Historic, groundbreaking, extraordinary, and who cares? Okay, great. Let's put it this way. There was great economic news for somebody, just not you. Okay, Monday morning, the stock market briefly passed a historic milestone. This is me. I'm quoting myself, okay? As the S&P 500, you can find it on ourfuture.org or Huffington Post. As the S&P 500 composite index briefly passed the 2,000 mark before ending the day on a record-breaking high. Then the next day, it cracked it at the end of the day, which makes the official record now 2,000 for the S&P 500, which was like 40, 50 years ago. Okay, so this is a big deal to investors, okay? Just the same way that cracking 10,000 on the Dow Jones Industrial Average was a big thing. How big a deal? Okay, let's talk about the Dow Jones for a second. A while back, in 1999, as a matter of fact, a money manager said that cracking 10,000 on the Dow Jones Industrial Average was the summit of Mount Dow. He called it Mount Dow's summit. Big, big deal. We cracked it later that year. We cracked 15,000. Then the stock, but before we did, of course, Wall Street's greed and so on, corporate greed decimated the middle class. Wall Street's greed crashed the market and threw tens of millions of people into un- and underemployment. They're still there. Now, these guys passed their 10,000 mark in 1999. We bailed them out. Then we've given them all sorts of tax breaks for corporations. They passed the 15,000 mark last year, in May of last year, after the bailout. And as of this writing, the Dow is over 17,000. Hey, everybody, great news. The market's hot. Corporate profits are soaring, and they're expected to stay this way. One guy wrote, based on the analyst forecasts of S&P 500 companies, profit margins will average 9.3% for this year and then jump to 10% in 2015. Sweet. So how are you doing? How are you doing out there? Are you doing great? I guess based on our statistics, I would say that a couple dozen of you are, and the other 200,000 or 300,000, not so much. Okay, corporate profits are at their highest level in 85 years. Employee compensation, in other words, wages earned by people who work for a living, at the lowest level in 65 years. Let me say that again. Corporate profits at their highest level in 85 years. Income from people who work for a living, lowest level in 65 years. This is why, whether it's talking about Borisage, about unions, or whether it's talking to the rest of us about forcing some political party to consistently speak for the middle class and lower income people. We mean it. It's an unjust system. It needs to change. Now, the benefits of increased productivity, let's talk about that for a second. Used to be, for the best decades of this country economically, from the end of World War II till about 30 years later, productivity increased dramatically and everybody's earnings increased right along with it. Then you get into the right about the time of the Reagan years, all of a sudden those two lines just split in two. Productivity soars, but ordinary people's income, most of us, the vast majority of us, completely flatlines. All that extra revenue goes to the very wealthiest among us. That's income theft, people, and we need to get it back. So, that began in the Carter years, but it got really, really bad under Reagan. You want to know what? While income is soaring among the 0.1% in this country, while they're getting all the wealth from productivity and nobody is, and by the way, that includes these guys, my last guest, Ron Kaminko of the Railroad Workers United. These guys are expected to ride alone in a train for 10, 12 hours with nobody to back them up, no help, hard to even go to the bathroom. They're not getting that, but the people who are getting the savings from cutting costs like that, they're all keeping it for themselves. Meanwhile, last year, a UNICEF report showed that the United States has the second highest child poverty rate in the entire developed world. The only country that's worse, but it's now defined as the developed world, is Romania. So to all intents and purposes, we have the highest child poverty rate in the developed world. We have people working 12-hour shifts with no break, all alone, while other people reap the economic benefits of that. And what are we talking about? Lowering the budget deficit, which already fell 24% last year. Let's stop lowering the budget deficit so quickly and let's put some people back to work. I'm Richard, RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour. We're going to use this break for another random news segment. I think you'll get a kick out of this one. Okay, I was, in going through my news feed, as I always do every day, JP Morgan. We talk a lot about JP Morgan around here. JP Morgan Chase working closely with law enforcement on cyber attack. This is from the Wall Street Journal. Computer hacking probe focused on as many as 5 banks. One of the problems we have now with our banking system is with these mega banks controlling so much of the market. The top 5 banks control 96% of the derivatives market now, or more. That a virus in one, even a computer virus, affects all of them because they're also very interlinked. It's not just that these guys are taking too much of our money and cheating and destroying the system, but they're also just creating instability by being so darn huge. So the Wall Street Journal said the FBI is investigating a possible computer hacking attack on JP Morgan and Company, in what people familiar with the situation described as a highly serious breach of corporate security. Now, the largest U.S. banks are saying that they are taking additional steps to safeguard sensitive or what do they say, confidential information. It appears to have been caused by malicious computer code. Thefts of U.S. corporate data have in the past often come from hackers based in China, Russia, or the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union, although that doesn't mean the attacks involved those governments. But here's my favorite quote from the whole thing. Get this. JP Morgan said Thursday morning, it's monitoring things now that it's been hacked, that it isn't seeing quote unquote unusual fraud. Ponder that for a moment. In other words, it's only seeing the usual fraud. The hackers aren't committing fraud, just their bankers. That's the situation we've got. Just the usual fraud. No need to worry, folks. It's just the usual fraud at JP Morgan Chase and our other big banks. We'll be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this was your moment of random news on the Zero Hour. And we are back on the Zero Hour. Joining us now, once again, is our good friend. We always love having her on the show, Dr. Lynn Paramore, author cultural theorist, producer, and media consultant, founding editor of New Deal 2.0, of the Roosevelt Institute, co-founder of RecessionWire.com. She writes for a lot of outlets, including Alternet, and she's been writing a lot of great stuff lately. Lynn, you've been making some observations on the economy from your usual... well, first of all, thanks for joining us. It's always great to have
pleasure
you.
to be here.
So listen, I wanted to talk to you about a number of things that you've written lately. You've been really cranking out a lot of good stuff. But
Thank you.
Yeah. What is it? Caffeine?
Yeah, it's called Feeding the Beast, as we say at Alternet. The show goes on, and it goes on quite rapidly.
So, oh, yes, it does. I know, because I write there myself. In fact, I've got something up there now myself, but I've been bumped by your marriage piece, right? Being the top slot. I did a piece on strange libertarian ideas. What have you been writing about the economy lately?
Well, I recently did an interview with my friend and a mentor of mine, Bill Lazonick, who is an economist who teaches at the University of Massachusetts Lowell. And he's been a big critic of something called shareholder value ideology, something that kind of started in American business schools in the 1980s that held that the purpose of a corporation was to maximize value for shareholders. And a lot of sort of unpleasant things for the rest of us have come out of that way of thinking, including a trend of stock buybacks, which is when a company uses cash to repurchase its own shares. And in doing so, they are able to manipulate stock prices in a way that enriches executives of the company. It's one of the ways that executive compensation has been boosted so dramatically in recent years, and it happens at the expense of workers and taxpayers. So he just came out with a big article in the Harvard Business Review, which is a good sign, actually, that this question is being raised in outlets like that have been traditionally, sort of more aligned with free market type thinking. So he has provided some insights into that, and I really have come to the conclusion myself that stock buybacks are a very bad idea.
And stock buybacks are something, it's interesting, this concept of the moral obligation to the shareholder. It's reflected in the shift in executive compensation that you mentioned. And it's basically another way to look at it is that, and I wrote a piece recently about the Institute for Policy Studies. They did a recent report on executive compensation because the Obamacare law does something to try to address that. And so this issue came up for me. That piece was helpful to me. But there's even beyond the economics of stock buybacks being a bad idea, there's a kind of, I don't know whether to call it an ethical question or, I mean, certainly morality is part of it, but the question of what is the responsibility of a board? Is it, obviously they're shareholders themselves, so the most selfish would be to adopt that philosophy, but that seems to be a departure. I mean, I wasn't around 75 years ago, but it seems to me there was a traditional, no matter what people think, but there seems to be a traditional view that a corporation and its board had an obligation to the workers, to the customers, to society as a whole. I mean, obviously, yes, they have to maximize profits. That's their fiduciary responsibility. But are you really seeing a shift in value systems as well as bad stock practices?
Yes, indeed. And as you mentioned, prior to the 1980s, a CEO of a public corporation, for example, would not be caught dead stating that the purpose of the corporation was to maximize profits and value for shareholders. And then even this idea of fiduciary duty is a really contested idea. There's a long-standing belief that that a company has some kind of legal obligation to maximize profits for its shareholders, and that actually is not the case. It's only the case in a very limited circumstance in which a company is going to be sold. And if you think about it logically, the reason for that is sometimes it is in the long-term interest of the company not to maximize shareholder value at a given time. Investments have to be made in research and development. Maybe the stock is going to take a hit for a little while. Investments need to be made in workers. And so, to more to your point, the shareholder value ideology sort of maintains that shareholders are the only ones that are taking risks in the company, and that's not true. Taxpayers take a great risk in the monies that are spent on things that help corporations do business, everything from infrastructure, to education, to research and development. How would the pharmaceutical companies exist without the research that goes on at the NIH, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And taxpayers don't have any guaranteed return for that investment at all. Workers often work above and beyond the call of duty in investing their time and energy into the creation of new products, and so they deserve to share some of the profits. And so when the money is used by the company to repurchase shares, it is at the expense of all those other parties who do indeed invest and deserve something back.
Well, and this is such a huge point. I mean, everybody watches, what's that movie? I'm going to blank on it now. The Jimmy Stewart Christmas movie, It's a Wonderful Life.
Wonderful Life,
and
yes.
I've always said, and he's a banker in that movie, and I've always said, by the way, that if he was Jamie Dimon, or when he's standing on that bridge waiting to jump, if he was a modern American banker, he should jump. But the notion there is that he's beloved because he puts the community into his decision-making process when he makes business decisions. And obviously that's a sentimental example, but you're absolutely right. One of the striking things about the shift in executive compensation, the shift in board compensation too, as boards have increasingly profited from more and more from being on the board of directors of a large corporation, the fact is, even fiscal responsibility is sometimes, as you point out, long-term. In other words, that fiduciary responsibility alone doesn't even mean this quarter. It may mean my responsibility is to make sure this corporation is sound 10 years from now.
That's exactly right. And in order to do that, you may need to take that cash and invest it in the development of new products. If you look at a company like Apple, they've been doing an awful lot of stock buybacks in recent years, and many people have noticed they haven't been doing an awful lot of producing new products that people want to use. There's a feeling that, they have not been as innovative as they may have been, and some suggest, including my friend Professor Lazonick, that the stock buyback emphasis at Apple has something to do with this. So another issue is that, you mentioned who sits on the boards. Well, the way we do things in the United States is not the way it's done in other parts of the world. In Germany, for example, publicly held company, you've got to have workers on that board. They get to help make the decisions about how resources are allocated. And that might be something that would be a good thing to adopt in the United States, that not only banning the stock buybacks, but making a rule that workers get to sit on the board and participate in decision making.
Well, I was a senior executive at one, and this is by way of a transition. I was a senior executive at one company. We used to meet with the board regularly, and the members of the board, who were well compensated, included a former Democratic White House chief of staff, a former Democratic governor of a Western state, former director of a major U.S. intelligence agency, a couple Republican politicians, and then a couple other 4 pals of the CEO. So net result, as you can imagine, was 1, a lot of rubber stamping of CEO decisions, and 2, a lot of help overcoming political obstacles. And I guess my point, yeah, you know where I'm going. And so don't we need some public policy as well as, corporations aren't going to reform themselves. The money's too big. The temptation's too great. Boards aren't going to reform themselves. CEOs aren't going to reform themselves. Don't we need a public policy initiative here? And don't we need to name and call out people who participate in this process from the political side?
Oh, absolutely. I think that kind of pressure is very much needed. And, we need to, as a society, remember what we are owed, and remember what these public corporations owe us. There's all kinds of ways that American corporations are getting out of fulfilling their obligations to society, whether it's stock buybacks or, reincorporating overseas to dodge taxes. And they would not exist if but for the largesse of the American government and taxpayer money and worker investment. So we need a mental shift, and yes, we need policies concerning corporate governance that, for example, make it illegal to do these kinds of stock buybacks. Maybe, there would be a couple of exceptions for special circumstances, but in general, to ban them and to make a rule that workers should sit on boards. And I agree with you. These corporations are not going to do it themselves. The executives are mostly self-dealing in the short term. And guess what? If they run the company into the ground by doing stock buybacks and failing to invest in the future of the company, they'll be gone before that means anything to them. CEOs could jump ship. They do it all the time. They have the golden parachute to save them and, screw everybody else. So that's the way we've been doing things here, I think, much to the detriment of our economy and our society.
Well, well said. And I think, we've got the, I think of it as the Independence Day model of finance driving this too. You remember the movie Independence Day, the giant flying saucers would come in and just suck anything of value out of a planet and then just leave this rotting husk and go on to the next one. I mean, that has become an essential part of whether it's, I think Bain Capital probably pioneered it, but you have these funds now who will come in and just milk a company for profit, sell it, leave it so leveraged, take a huge consulting fee, and then leave it so leveraged with debt that it struggles to survive. But in the meantime, all the executives and board members, as you say, have cashed out and gone home and left that as someone else's problem, including the economies, the overall American economies. So, assuming you agree with that, and then we'll take a break. But if you have any closing
absolutely,
thoughts,
I agree with that.
If you have any closing thoughts on that, then we'll come back with the, sex with robots and all that stuff. But
Yes, just very briefly, this is one of the things that's driving inequality in our society. All the gains being funneled to the top, and everybody else being left high and dry. And the stock buybacks is just one example, but a very egregious example about how this is done. And it's certainly something that needs to be reformed. Fortunately, people are beginning to pay some attention to it, and I do think when the Harvard Business Review comes out with an article criticizing that ideology, we may be seeing a shift in thinking. I'm feeling hopeful about that.
Well, where can people go to read a little bit more about this from your end?
They can go to find my interview on Alternet with William Lazonick. I believe the title of that is, CEO. The dirty little secret of how CEOs enrich themselves at your expense. You could also pick up the current issue of the Harvard Business Review at your newsstand and see an in-depth article by Professor Lazonick on the topic.
All right. Well, we are going to take a brief break, and when we come back after this, we will be talking, as people who have heard our previous segments with Dr. Paramore know, everything is economic, even sex with robots and temporary marriage. So we will be back on those subjects and whatever else comes to mind. We always love having her on the show with Lynn Paramore. I am Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour. Right, this is Richard RJ Eskow, and during this break, we will be having one more random news segment for you. Random news of the week. A new report in the International Business Times says that the discovery of 15 new monuments has transformed the mystery of Stonehenge. The article says scientists have made such great strides in decoding what's going on there, the mysteries of Stonehenge, if you like, that one of the ancient world's most ancient relics is now better understood than ever before. A new study said that the new study is called, I believe, the Stonehenge Hidden Landscape Project. It says that researchers found 15 new monuments around the 4,000-year-old ring of standing stones in northern England. The 15 hidden relics included hedges, pits, ditches, and barrows. Barrows are mounds of stone and dirt which are used to mark a grave or graves. These findings suggest that Stonehenge was not just an isolated place which was only visited for rituals, but which was what scientists once thought, but was once bustling with all kinds of activity, as the article puts it. You know who knew about this long before anyone else? Spinal Tap. Remember the Spinal Tap movie and their Druid song? Remember how they introduced it? This is one of my favorite bits from any movie, I think. Remember, hundreds of years ago, before the dawn of history, I love that line, hundreds of years ago, there were a people called the Druids, and we now learn that a ritual life was a central part of ordinary community life, or at least it appears that way based on these new discoveries. So we will keep you posted on events in Stonehenge. As Spinal Tap put it, no one knows who they were or what they were doing. But someone knows what the CEO of Centerplate Corporation was doing in an elevator this week in a horrid video that went quickly viral. Elevator video shot from above from those little security cameras. The CEO of Centerplate was seen kicking a dog on a leash that was doing absolutely nothing wrong. It's sickening to watch. I encourage you not to watch it. Kicking a harmless dog on a leash who was lying down and trying to make himself as unthreatening as possible while this jerk continued to kick him and then dragged him out of the elevator. He insisted that this was not part of his nature and that he was merely frustrated by the behavior of a friend's dog. Well, it turns out he was still lying because it wasn't a friend's dog. It was his dog. The Humane Society went to his home that night, found the dog, which was his, and took it out of his care. The corporation responded to that by saying that they were going to send him in to anger management. But the question is this. First of all, what will the consequences be for the CEO? What will the consequences be for Centerplate? There was a recent article suggesting that people were no longer going to buy their products. A reporter went out to... what they do is they sell concession food and so on at ball games. And a reporter went out to a ball game, and a number of people said that they weren't intending to buy a hot dog while they were there. But the real question we have to ask ourselves is this: isn't that the kind of behavior that we're encouraging in executives nowadays? In other words, isn't this guy merely playing to type? He says it was out of character, but our system is designed in many ways to encourage this kind of aggression in executives and to celebrate it as somehow being an ideal. That's what we got to think about, as well as protecting the innocent animals and other creatures of this planet. So we will be right back after this with more from Dr. Lynn Paramore. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour. And we are back with Dr. Lynn Paramore. We were talking economics, and in a sense we will still be, but Lynn, you recently wrote an article that, look, it was bound to catch anybody's eye, I suppose, and on sex with robots. And by the way, before we go on, I actually know a little bit about this because I'm an affiliated scholar with the Institute for Ethics in Emerging Technologies, which deals with a lot of these issues of technology and humanity in the human future. And I participated in a book of 50 futurists, I think it was, although I don't use that word. So I think it's a fascinating topic, more so than people give it credit for. And it sounds crazy, though. So tell us why you wrote that article and what you thought about the topic.
Yes, well, there's certainly been a lot of hysteria over robots lately. Anytime the economy is doing badly, people become very fearful of robots and afraid that robots are going to be taking jobs and so on. Economists are about split down the middle on whether or not increased robot technology is going to cause a net gain or a net loss in jobs. I tend to be in the net gain category. But the question has arisen if we're going to be socially interacting with robots and perhaps even sexually interacting with them, will they replace sex workers? And the whole question of sex with robots sounds like something out of a science fiction movie. I mean, we just had the movie Her, which shows a man having a romantic relationship with a computer operating system, and most people think, well, that's pretty far-fetched. That could never happen to me. But a lot of experts say that in the coming decades, decades, robots are going to become a lot more sophisticated. They're going to be able to respond to and detect human emotions. They're going to understand our speech better and become a lot more like us. And so a lot of them are predicting that sexual interaction, romance, possibly even marriage with robots is on the horizon. And it just raises a host of very fascinating questions about human behavior, perhaps robots having rights, the legal and ethical issues surrounding this. It's just a tremendously interesting topic.
Well, it absolutely is, and not for the salacious reasons that people might think. Philosophically, it raises enormous questions. I did a thing also, by the way, I've found that a lot of people who are very oriented towards this sort of thinking, who, for example, are concerned about the civil rights of potential artificial intelligences. I, by the way, am not sure we'll ever have a true artificial consciousness, but the people who are concerned about that issue, the civil rights of an artificial consciousness, many of them, I did a piece during the break, a news item about the CEO who kicked a dog. Many of them are very equally interested in the rights of what they describe as non-human persons, chimpanzees, dolphins, other intelligent animals. Many animals now show a sense of self-awareness. So there's an intersection, interestingly enough, between the issue of animal rights and the issue of potentially rights for artificial consciousnesses or robots or whatever. But the whole idea of, a guy wrote a book, Love and Sex with Robots, and so on. I guess one of the things I bring to this issue, though, is that concerns me. We even had the case of a Japanese man who formerly married an anime character. I don't know if you remember that story. But,
yes.
Strange things happen. But here's what bothers me the most about it. There are a lot of people out there, and I've encountered some of them, who really believe there is no essential difference between a living thing and something that appears to all intents and purposes to be alive. In other words, they can't acknowledge that your cat might, if you have one, might be different substantially from a robot that's made to behave like a cat. And it's a profound philosophical thing we can't address here. But what worries me is that sometimes I think that people are going to blur these boundaries, which, if taken to an extreme, is a kind of psychosis.
Yes, that's a very interesting thing. And on the issue of the question about animals and robots intersecting, I find that very intriguing. And, there's this, human beings we're pretty narcissistic creatures, and we tend to anthropomorphize anything around us that isn't human. In terms of our pets, for example, in this era compared to others, and our culture compared to others in the world, we do tend to treat our pets as if they were little human beings. And some of that is not necessarily in the pet's interest. They see a dog seems to reflect human emotions. They may indeed have evolved to do that for survival purposes, to elicit warm and fuzzy human responses in order to get fed, etc. But they aren't human, and they have needs that are not the same as human needs, and they can suffer greatly when their essential difference is not recognized. So I think that's a really interesting thing. In terms of the ethical questions surrounding sex and romance with robots, one of the most interesting questions that I found had to do with pedophiles. There are some experts who think that a child robot, a robot in the form of a human child, might be a way of treating pedophiles. To assign them a robot, perhaps that would obviate the need for them to act out their impulses on human children. Now, that's a big question. Maybe it would. Maybe, on the other hand, it would amplify their predilection. It's really hard to know. I also suspect that in many cases, a pedophile's compulsion is in part driven by the interaction with a human being, the chase and the trust that's built with a child. And I don't think that experience is going to be the same with a robot. So I think people sometimes leap to conclusions, and as you point out, they don't necessarily take into account that there is a pretty essential difference between interacting with a robot and a human. I mean, the robot, for example, never says no. I mean, that's That's an essential component of that kind of relationship, whereas human beings are somewhat unpredictable. They have variable emotions and so on, and it's a much more complicated interaction.
Right. No, I think that's such a huge and interesting point. I think in terms of the issue of pedophilia, which you mentioned in your article, one of the valuable things about these types of debates or discussions for me is the self-reflection it forces. And so when someone says, well, let's just give a pedophile a child robot, many of us, and myself included, feel revulsion and horror, and that's a terrible thing to do. But if it were to make children safer, it's probably the moral thing to do. So I learned something about myself in reading that. I struggle with morality, which is how we grow. But B, I think you're absolutely right. And I think this is a point that gets lost in this whole discussion of sex, romance, and other relationships with robots, is that the humanity, for good or evil, I mean, in a pedophilia case, it's a dark thing, the pursuit and so on. But the fact that, in a healthy human being, I would argue that the emotional bonds with another human being, even in a casual relationship, and the making contact and the mutual persuasion and all that is part of the process. And just saying, initiate program, is in a sense sacrificing part of your humanity, no matter how realistic a simulation may be. But I fear, I mean, I don't know if it's harmful, but I wonder if many people feel the same way, or a lot of people would feel differently.
Yes, and there's another area that interests me, that got a topic that got raised in the comments on my article, which I had not really thought much about. I got a comment, for example, from a severely disabled man, and he said that he would very much prefer to have sexual relations with a human being, but he found it extremely difficult to get human beings to accept his condition, and therefore, as a substitute, he would welcome the opportunity to interact sexually with a robot. And that's a pretty poignant thing, I had to sit down and think about that man's experience. It's not just a titillating subject at that point. This is a very real human need that this man has that's not being met, and it is causing him a lot of distress and depression. There are also people out there who have severe shyness, mental challenges, emotional challenges that make relating with a human sexually very, very fraught and difficult, if not impossible. And so should they simply be sexless beings? Is there a way to incorporate robot sexuality into their lives and in a positive way? It's a question that I'm thinking about now, and I tend to think, well, if it helps them, why not?
Well, maybe we can update psychologist Abraham Maslow and come up with a hierarchy of robotic needs. And
right.
Maybe among them will be, look, if it's the only alternative, it's more humane than nothing, which I think we would say now. But as always, Lynn, thanks so much for joining us on these and talking about these very fascinating comments. Now you have a new piece on temporary marriage, which would also be fascinating, but we don't have time to get to it. So as always, Lynn Paramore, thanks for joining us.
Oh, it's always nice to talk to you.
Thank you. We'll be right back after this with Ryan Grimm from the Huffington Post. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour. All right, we are back for a random news break on the Zero Hour, and since we've been talking about wages and the fact that wages were flat for most people following the Reagan era, well, the mid-'70s, but really the Reagan era, that after 30 years of productivity and wages rising together, productivity soared, but wages stayed flat. So in our random news break, not so random actually, latest report shows that wages fell for high-wage earners and those with a college degree, groups with the lowest levels of unemployment. Now that's interesting. Now we're not talking about the 0.1% here. We're talking about, let's say, the top 10% or so. I don't have that exact statistic in front of me, but relatively high wage earners, people who do quite well, those with a college degree, those are groups with low level employment. And traditional economics says when employment is low, wages rise. But there's something going on that caused those wages to fall. Now, one theory is that is because there are so many other workers waiting in line. Even though unemployment is low, there are workers down the wage scale waiting in line to move up that are or underemployed, and that there may be some sort of bleed over effect. But this is interesting. It shows, as economists are saying, there was a recent meeting of the Federal Reserve. This is one of the reasons why the Federal Reserve should not concentrate on raising interest rates. It should continue to concentrate on the problem with unemployment and underemployment, as Janet Yellen, head of the Federal Reserve, indicated that she would do. Wages for the broad middle class declined over the last year, we're told, as they have for most of the past 40 years. And as these economists tell us, dismal wage growth has been a key contributor to income stagnation and growing income inequality. The only group not to have their wages go down was minimum wage workers because of minimum wage laws, which shows we need to protect them and strengthen them every chance we get. I am Richard RJ Eskow. This has been your random news break from the Zero Hour. We are back on the Zero Hour. In this final segment, we'll be talking a little bit about net neutrality. Now, net neutrality is one of those terms that a lot of people still don't seem to understand. What it really means is, are you going to have a chance to access the internet as we've always known it? Are you going to have a chance without paying extra money, or without your provider or your internet web page, whatever site you happen to go to, paying extra money? Are you going to be able to see what you want to see, and are you going to be able to see it at the speed with which you want to see it? Now, a couple quick thoughts on that. One is, of course, the internet was built, that technology was created at government expense, which should create a certain moral obligation on the part of those attempting to charge for it. Two, we need smart reporters and analysts talking about it, and one of them is joining us, Ryan Grimm, who is a senior editor with the Huffington Post, Washington bureau chief, and has been covering this topic, has an article that will be out on Monday updating us on the issue of net neutrality. Ryan, are you with us?
I'm with you, RJ.
That's awesome. So tell us a little bit about what we are going to learn when we read your piece on Monday morning.
So all of the focus is on the chairman of the FCC. It's got Chairman Wheeler, who's a probably won't surprise people. He's a former lobbyist for the cable and the wireless industry. He's a guy in his late 60s whose entire kind of experience with the internet has been to perceive it kind of as a business opportunity for these various players, and so he put out in the spring a proposal for a new rule that would really destroy net neutrality, and very curiously he followed that up by saying that he had not done so. It was quite strange. It was. And from a lot of the people I spoke to, they think that it's quite possible that he genuinely does believe that his rule protects net neutrality, while in fact the letter of it creates a fast lane that would allow providers to charge for, which destroys net neutrality. On a lot of levels, this is complicated stuff, but in that sense, it's rather simple. So it's just strange to where he's coming from, and so all of the focus has been on this guy. And he has said he's open to revisions for the final rule that is put out in the fall. And the question has been, can he be pressured into writing a stronger rule, et cetera, et cetera. My story looks past him and says perhaps he's a lost cause for net neutrality advocates, and it instead looks at the two other Democratic chairmen who are on this committee, because the Republicans are almost guaranteed to vote against whatever Tom Wheeler comes up with, and that means that Wheeler needs the votes of the two women who are the other two commissioners, and that gives them outsized leverage that commissioners don't normally have on a regulatory level, because their votes are usually assumed. It's assumed to be a fairly partisan process, and they'll go along with the commissioner. But that very well might not be the case here. And if they don't go along with him, then he cannot gut net neutrality.
So the idea of your piece is to focus attention on these other two Democratic commissioners, to make them, in effect, a firewall so Wheeler can't do what he wants to do, and force him to propose something that will get past them, which presumably would be something that protects net neutrality if they can be persuaded to take that position.
That's exactly right. I mean, nothing can get done without them unless he writes something that the two Republicans are willing to go for, which is unlikely that he would go so far as to take that path, especially with the president recently kind of chiding the FCC and speaking publicly kind of against their rule, and saying that there shouldn't be a fast lane that you can charge people to use. And these two people, these two women on the commission, are both people that want to have political futures, and this will wind up being kind of the highest profile move that they have made in their political lives, and they're both interesting figures in their own right. One of them is Mignon Clyburn, who, as the name suggests, is the daughter of Jim Clyburn, and she's always been a strong public advocate of net neutrality, probably the strongest on the commission, and so the advocates really do hope and expect that she'll use her influence to push Wheeler in a more progressive direction. And the other is Jessica Rosenworcel, who's a former Hill staffer, very politically savvy and politically minded staffer, who's everyone says is extremely smart, understands the policy and the politics better than anybody. She herself made a play to become chairman of the commission, so we don't even have to wonder about what her ambitions are. She rounded up signatures from a couple dozen senators urging the president to make her chair. It didn't happen, but that's clearly where she wants to go. And if she takes part in the dismantling of net neutrality, she understands quite well that she could lose progressive support for an eventual bid to become chairman.
Well, what's the strategy then? So these groups have identified these two folks, these two additional commissioners, as a kind of bulwark against Wheeler and his fast lane idea. There must be some kind of, is it a letter writing strategy, or are people targeting them in some way to pressure them?
Yeah, so Demand Progress is probably the most high-profile, liberal group that works on this issue. Co-founded by Aaron Swartz, and they were in the comment period, and so they've been driving comments on this issue, but and they've been driving them specifically to these Democratic members of the commission, Comcast and Time Warner recently announced that they were putting up $132,000 for a dinner that was going to celebrate Mignon Clyburn, and there was a lot of pushback against that, and they quickly withdrew their sponsorship of the event because of the unseemliness of it, that they would be lavishing all of this money on an event honoring a person who's about to have power over the future of their industry. So that's one signal that that there's power at play here. But it's not. This is not this is not an effort that has a lot of corporate backing on the opposite side. You have the cable companies, the broadband providers, really aggressively working it. But interestingly, the people who you presume would benefit from this and have always been talked about as the big net neutrality advocates, your Google, your Facebook, have not actually been that heavily involved in the fight. So that leaves it to these more just progressive-minded activists.
Well, I would think it makes the political field a little easier for the activists because people, no matter how much I write criticizing them, nobody listens to me. People still idealize, companies. A lot of people do anyway. Companies like Google and Facebook. If they're basically staying out of this, and it's just the cable companies. Everybody hates the cable companies, so they can't really provide political cover for these commissioners. As you said, that dinner even had to be canceled. So I guess in the minute or two we have left, are activists optimistic that this is going to work? Are they drumming up support? Are they getting the support they wanted?
I think that they think they have a shot at it. They're not resigned to defeat. This is one of the most consequential decisions that's going to be made in Washington in 2014, and they feel like that with the public interest backgrounds of these two commissioners that they have a real shot at convincing them, especially because they're inclined to be allies in the first place, and all they're trying to do is make the case that look, this is not only in the best interests of the public, it's also in the best interests of your future political careers.
Well, I think that's a great point, and we're going to have to leave it there. But you also made a very important point, which is this is one of the most important decisions that's going to be made in 2014. It has far-reaching implications. So I encourage people to look for that article. Ryan Grimm, Washington bureau chief of the Huffington Post. Thanks so much for joining us.
No, thank you.
I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and we will be right back after this on the Zero Hour. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and it's time for your random news break. And now, look, I usually try to focus on people that can be pressured and persuaded, that is to say, in the political world and commentator world, Democrats and centrists and so on. But I got to share with you for your random news break a quote from Bill Kristol, the conservative commentator who was so instrumental in persuading the country into our tragically misguided war in Iraq. He now wants us to go full bore once again in Iraq and Syria. Here's what he said recently on Laura Ingram's radio show. And I quote Bill Kristol, "What's the harm of bombing them for at least for a few weeks and seeing what happens? I'll repeat that sentence. What's the harm of bombing them at least for a few weeks and seeing what happens? I don't think there's much in the way of unanticipated side effects that are going to be bad there." Now, this is what the Daily Show would call your moment of Zen. The man who said going into Iraq would be so easy, we'd be out of there in 6 months, there was no way it could go wrong, just said, I don't think there's much in the way of unanticipated side effects that's going to be bad there. Now, we know from experience that, for example, the Caliph, so-called self-described Caliph, really thug, who runs the ISIS group, was a street thug, apparently, who was imprisoned by the U.S. government and radicalized there and turned from a gangster into a terrorist leader. But Bill Kristol says, I don't think there's much of unanticipated side effects that could go wrong there. Well, if you listen to Bill Kristol, you've lost your freaking mind. And in our next hour, we'll be talking about what could go wrong in Iraq. I'm Richard RJ Eskow. This has been your random news break from the Zero Hour.
This is The Zero Hour with RJ Eskow, produced by the WeAct Radio Network in Washington, D.C., and broadcast across the nation. Visit us online at thisisthezerohour.com or at youtube.com/thezerohour. Ladies and gentlemen, RJ Eskow.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to this segment of the Zero Hour. You know, biologists tell us that there's a lot of strange life out there. They tell us that there are life forms that exist in the most extreme of conditions. There are microorganisms that live in boiling water. There's a fungus that lives at the core of the Chernobyl nuclear reactor's water core. There's a life form for every extreme situation. And I guess you could say that politics is a little bit like that too. Sometimes political ideas thrive in the strangest and most extreme environments. For example, when self-centered billionaires want to justify their diversion of our national wealth or rapacious business practices, they may turn to a political philosophy called libertarianism. Now, I've been rough on libertarianism in the past, and I don't want to give the wrong impression. I think that a lot of ideas that seem outside the political mainstream are worth encouraging. I certainly think debates outside the political mainstream are worth encouraging. Number one, because we have freedom of speech. Number two, because creative, out-of-the-box ideas are how we generate new ways of looking at our world. So I'm not against anybody in principle saying whatever they want, but here's what bugs me about libertarianism. What bugs me, first of all, it's a catch-all word. A lot of people who call themselves libertarians don't really hold some of the ideals that libertarian writers and philosophers push, and good for them, because some of those ideas are nuts. But some of these billionaires out there, Ayn Rand, who kind of founded modern libertarianism, they have insane ideas. So I have a piece out in Alternet right now about the 6 strangest ideas in libertarianism. That's the title they gave it. I'm not sure it's the best one because there are a lot of strange ideas out there, but I did find a few, and I wanted to share them with you a little bit, especially now that we hear reporters talking about the idea that the Republican Party might be having a libertarian moment. They might want to think about that. Here are a few of libertarianism's strange ideas. One, that parents should be allowed to let their children starve to death. Murray Rothbard, who co-founded the Ludwig von Mises Institute, which is popular among libertarians, economist. I didn't make this up. Now, to be clear, Murray Rothbard, libertarian economist, did not think that parents should let their children starve to death. He merely thought they should be allowed to do so. Rothbard wrote that a parent does not have the right to aggress against his children, but also should not have a legal obligation to feed, clothe, or educate his children, since such obligations would entail positive acts coerced upon the parents, and therefore deprive the parents of his rights. The parent therefore may not murder or mutilate his child, and the law properly outlaws a parent from doing so, but he should have a right not to feed the child, that is, to allow it to die. Now, I would say this is not something you want to encourage a political philosophy to adopt. Rothbard also, by the way, says, and I quote, "We believe in a libertarian society, the existence of a free baby market will bring neglect, quote unquote, down to a minimum." Now, that's interesting. Well, I got to give Rothbard credit. At least he's internally consistent about his ideas about freedom from government. Not a lot of libertarians are, but that free baby market thing, that stuck with me. Maybe that'll be what they call the sharing economy next. Maybe there'll be like an Uber type website for babies. And speaking of Uber, they believe we must deregulate companies like Uber, even if they cheat. Uber's been caught doing a lot of cheating against its competitor Lyft, booking rides and then not, or having its employees book rides which they then don't take, or using the rides only for a short distance in order to try to pitch the driver to leave and come over to Uber, or misleading its own drivers by sending them texts saying that they can't work for Uber and Lyft because it's against state law, even when it isn't. But nevertheless, libertarian Nick Gillespie wrote in Time magazine that the government should stop harassing Uber, that regulators are acting like mobsters, and that letting markets work to find new ways of delivering goods and services isn't just better for customers in the short term, it's the only way to unleash the innovation that ultimately propels long-term growth. That is the libertarian myth in a nutshell, that gangsterism and lying and cheating is actually some form of innovation. And I think they actually believe that stuff sometimes, which is scary. They also believe we should eliminate Social Security and Medicare. that society doesn't have the right to enforce basic justice in public places of business. For example, that business owners should be allowed to discriminate, and even that democracy itself is unacceptable. Here's what libertarian billionaire Peter Thiel said. He said, quote, since 1920, the vast increase in welfare beneficiaries and the extension of the franchise to women, two constituencies that are notoriously tough for libertarians, have rendered the notion of capitalist democracy an oxymoron. In other words, if you got to choose between capitalism and democracy, I choose capitalism every time. And we'll just close by saying Thiel also believes that he says he remains committed to the faith of my teenage years, to authentic human freedom as a precondition for the highest good. I stand against confiscatory taxes, totalitarian collectives, and the ideology of the inevitability of death against for every individual. So he wants everybody to live forever, an experience that they will no doubt monetize as they monetize Uber and every other internet service, and which perhaps will leave us facing an eternity of spam and curated content. Personally, I'd rather die. And if the Republican Party decides to adopt these philosophies, apparently it would rather die too. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour. And we are back on the Zero Hour, and I briefly, through some technical problems here on my end, lost contact with Mothership, but I believe we are back, and I believe we have with us now Stephen Miles, who is with the group, and I always get this wrong, World Without War. I believe I've gotten that right. If he is with us, he will correct me on it. We'll be talking about the situation in the Middle East. Stephen, are you with us?
I am, and it's Win Without War.
I always get that wrong. Whatever it is, I think it's the opposite. I'm sorry about that, but it's Win Without War. And
Both
thanks so much for joining.
Both are good ideas.
I totally agree. All right, I won't go off on World Without Love or Peter and Gordon or anything. Listen, so the situation is proceeding in the Middle East. We had, understandably, a lot of people were deeply, and rightfully, a lot of people were deeply upset by the ISIS video showing the beheading of journalist James Foley. We have escalating tensions. We have calls for, in the military, for bombing in both Syria as well as Iraq against the so-called ISIS state. I would argue it is neither Islamic nor a state, but it calls itself IS, or Islamic State. And I think the left is divided and struggling with its own conscience on this issue. So, first of all, I guess I would say, have I left anything out of my update? And secondly, like to get your thoughts on this.
Yeah, no, I think that's a pretty good roundup. I'll say I think it's less that folks are divided than the reality is that we once again find ourselves facing a situation in which there's a tremendous amount of human suffering. There's a strong desire to do something about that suffering, and we're confronted with the reality where there are very few and very possibly no good options, and a series of options that are varying degrees of bad that we're trying to choose amongst. And so that's where we find ourselves today. This isn't a new conflict. We see kind of daily images, and some of them, like you mentioned, with the execution of the journalist James Foley, are incredibly shocking and bring this home to us in a way that we haven't quite felt it before. But the reality is this is a conflict that's been going on kind of in Syria for the last 3 years. And in some ways, this is a conflict that's been going on for the last 11 years since our original invasion of Iraq back in 2003. So it's unfortunately not new. The kind of spike we're seeing now is a kind of unfortunate reminder of just how horrible things are.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, and of course, there's a Sunni versus Shiite angle to all this, which in many ways seems to parallel tribal and regional divisions as much as just theological. I think in many cases it's not so much theological as the theology comes up from tribal and regional differences that are equally long-standing. I mean, I think it's striking, for example, was reading more about the guy who seems to be running the IS operation, which is, he calls himself a caliph. He calls himself Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, and if you know your Middle Eastern history, Abu Bakr was the first caliph after the death of the Prophet Muhammad. He is, now the Shiites wanted the caliph to be Ali. Instead, Abu Bakr was chosen, so that's already an anti-Shiite gesture as far as I can tell, and he's the al-Baghdadi, means from Baghdad, of course, and he, from what I was reading, was an American prisoner in one of the American camps, and before that was a sort of a street gangster more than a political or theological figure. Do you know about him? Do you know if in fact that's the case?
Yeah, he was a prisoner during the original Iraq War, in American custody for a while, and met some of the folks he's got reportedly in senior positions within ISIS or the Islamic State. Met him while in prison, met them while in these U.S. detention facilities, and you're right to say, you know, a lot of this is kind of the Sunni Shia divide, but it's a lot more complicated than that, actually. And just when you look at even one theoretically faction, the ISIS fighters, you see within them kind of lots of different people who are fighting with them for lots of different reasons. Some of them are kind of true believers of this radical brand of Wahhabism that believes in kind of this perverted ideology that they profess to be leaders of. Others are simply kind of paid mercenaries, for lack of a better term, who fight with them because they pay more than any of the other militias around. Some of them are the former Ba'athist members of the Saddam regime, who were leaders and military leaders and government leaders of one form or another, and have been kind of banned during the period after the fall of Saddam as part of the de-Baathification, and kind of have nowhere else to go. And then even more, some of them are local tribesmen, some of the very folks that were on our side when we fought many of these same people as part of the Anbar awakening back in 2006, 2007, when the Sunni tribes decided to turn against the predecessor to ISIS, which was then Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and now are kind of back on that side after becoming disillusioned with the Maliki government. So, and that's just one faction of the fight in Iraq. And when you broaden out and you talk about the broader conflict, what you're looking at is something stretching from the Mediterranean Sea to the Persian Gulf, with literally dozens of different factions, and people are fighting for various different reasons, and it's incredibly complex. And I have to say, unfortunately, after decades of being involved in the Middle East, we still have an uncanny ability to singularly understand the situation poorly when we try to look at it from afar.
Well, and I think also to singularly do that thing which will act against our own and everyone else's best interest sometimes. I mean, to a certain extent, that's what I was getting at by mentioning the imprisoning of the so-called caliph, who was then able to network in prison with his senior executives, whatever he calls them, and also presumably was more radicalized by that experience, and the arms that, the money that they're paying their militia members is money that they're getting through unsecured U.S. arms, among other things, and the Baathists that were fired by Brewer or whatever the governor general was under Bush, another bad call. They're now fighting for the other side. So it seems that when we understandably, as you put it, want to step in. I quoted during one of my news breaks, I think I meant to quote Bill Kristol saying, let's just bomb him for a few weeks. Nothing bad or unforeseen could happen. Let's just see how it goes. Let's just, that we seem to do a lot of things, sometimes in the interest of trying to help, that make the situation worse, and that if anything should be a sign that we ought to move very, very carefully from this moment forward. Am I missing something?
No, I mean, nowhere on earth is the law of unintended consequences more on display than in America's policy towards Iraq. I mean, we have just despite our best intentions, caused some of the very problems we're now struggling with through our actions. You cannot talk about Iraq and Syria today without understanding how much of that was caused by the decision of the Bush administration to go to war there in 2003, and all of the consequences that come from that. And this is why it's important to understand that when you have these kind of deep humanitarian suffering and situations like we see now, you have to understand that the reality is that we can make it worse despite our best intentions. We may be trying to save lives at times, yet ultimately prolong the suffering, prolong the conflict, make the conflict worse. And that's what we have to guard against. It's the old adage, first do no harm. That really needs to be our mantra.
Well, I think that's a great point, and I'm going to want to get into that a little more. But I think just to round off this circle about us, doing harm where we may even not intend to, it seems to me that a year ago we were, and I actually do need a reality check with you on this because my head is kind of twisted a little bit. But it definitely seems to me that a year ago we were arming people who were fighting against Assad, and now when we talk about bombing ISIS in Iraq, we're talking about bombing the people who are fighting against Assad, who presumably are the same people we were talking about, or some of the same people we were talking about arming last year.
Yeah, you're exactly right. The notion that we are today talking about intervening in the middle of a civil war in Syria on completely the opposite side that we were about to intervene last year, if nothing else, should cause us all to take a giant step back and say, what is going on here? What are we talking about? We were hours away, by all measure, from bombing Syria last year. We may be on the verge of bombing Syria again this year, but in the intervening year, the consequences of our bombing would have 180 degrees the opposite effect. This is the reality of what happens when you get involved in the middle of a kind of multifaceted conflict. And it's impossible to, again, despite your best intentions, it's impossible to simply wish away the inevitable consequences of what we're talking about doing.
Yeah, it seems to me that, and then we'll take a break and maybe talk about approaches that would work, but it seems to me that we're constantly being manipulated emotionally, and I say that not because I have a lack of compassion for everybody that's suffering. I do, but a year ago we were seeing the horrific pictures of that young boy who was tortured to death by Assad's people. Now we're seeing the images of James Foley. They're both ghastly and horrifying, but you can find them on both sides, and we need to have a talk about how to reduce the suffering in a way that doesn't inflame one side at the expense of the other. So maybe when we come back from a break, we can talk a little bit more about this. But we're talking with Stephen Miles from Win Without War about the conflict in Iraq and Syria, how to think about it, what we might do about it. So I'm Richard RJ Eskow. We will be right back after this. This is The Zero Hour. And we are back on the Zero Hour talking about the situation in Iraq with Stephen Miles, who is Advocacy Director for Win Without War, a diverse coalition of 40 member organizations formed in opposition to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and the underlying national security strategy that created them. And when we went to break, we were talking about we're always reacting to the last horror, the horror of the child that Assad's forces tortured to death, the horror of James Foley's beheading, and of course they're on opposite sides of this conflict, Assad in Syria and ISIS in Syria and Iraq. Now we seem to be wanting to attack ISIS in Iraq, which would benefit Assad, so we've kind of switched there. What's the way out? How do we get out of this thing?
Well, the short answer, as we said at the outset, is that there is no quick, easy way out. We have to kind of acknowledge that and accept that unfortunate reality. We all want to be able to pick up pick up the phone and make a call or push a button, and it's going to make the human suffering that we're seeing in Iraq and Syria end. It's totally understandable that we want to do that. Unfortunately, that's not in the cards. There's just too many people fighting too many different wars for too many different reasons going on all at the same time. And part of what has to happen is that the people on the ground have to decide they don't want to fight those battles anymore. At the root cause of both conflicts, both in Iraq and Syria, what you have is you have a massive amount of people who are non-represented by the political institutions, the governments that are supposed to represent them, and they want the understandable human dignity, the ability to influence their lives, the ability to have some say over the lives that they want to live, and that's denied to them, both in Iraq and both in Syria. In Syria, the Assad government is brutally repressive, clearly not representative of a large majority of its people. In Iraq, the Sunni population, which was previously in power, has been completely and utterly kind of taken out of government by the Maliki government. So what has to change, part of what has to change is those governments have to be changed, those institutions have to be changed so that people can feel like they have a say, they have a way of expressing themselves simply other than trying to fight and kill one another. And until that happens, you can limit the fighting. We can go send Americans back in there to try to stand between the parties so that they stop fighting. We can take some of the worst offenders off the battlefield with bombs. But the root causes of those conflicts won't be solved. And unless and until you solve those root causes, you're only managing the violence, managing the death. And you can get it down to a more reasonable level, perhaps, but you're not going to solve it. And as soon as we stop, it's going to come right back, and it's going to come back as bad as it ever has.
Well, I guess a lot of people would hear that and say, yeah, we should go in and get it down to a manageable level, even if that's all we can do. What do you say to that?
Well, again, it's an understandable impulse, but it's not the whole part of the story. I mean, you have to remember the dramatic cost both to us and to the combatants that's involved in that. So kind of what people like to talk about, this notion that somehow the Iraq war had been won back before the troops left. We spent several $1 trillion in Iraq. 4,500 Americans, give or take, lost their lives. But more to the point, hundreds of thousands of Iraqis lost their lives in all the suffering. So it's not as if there was some sort of a magic easy switch in which you got to the end of that suffering. It was dramatically costly. And from, everything I've seen, I don't think the American public's particularly interested in paying those costs again. And so there's people who like to talk as if you were going to get that same outcome with simply dropping some Hellfire missiles off of a drone, or maybe flying a couple F-16s or B-1 bombers over the battlefield and dropping some bombs. That's not the reality. The reality is that you're trading some security on our side of that equation for insecurity on the other side. Bombs inevitably miss their targets. The human suffering is inevitably bad. But on top of that, the enemy that is out there, ISIS, wants nothing more than for this to be a fight about them and the West. They want it to be about something that they can go to Sunnis and they can say, who are you with here? Are you with us or are you with the Americans? We're your tribesmen. We're your brothers. Aren't you with us, not the Americans? And that's the battle they want. If we're not there for them to make the enemy of, no one wants to live under these guys. No one wants to live with this kind of brutal dictatorship, this kind of mass beheadings and executions and completely horrific violence. But the ability they have to point to others and say, you're in a fight with others, whether it's us, whether it's the Shiite government in Baghdad, whether it's the Kurds, whether it's Assad's government, to point to someone else and say, you're on our side, not their side, so join with us in fighting them. That's what they want. That's the only way they're able to stay in power. I just wrote something that said, this is a movement that can only survive during war. They thrive off war. They want nothing more than a fight. They do things like behead an American to get us to join the fight. They want us to come bomb them so that they can make it about us instead of being about them.
Well, I think that's a terrific point. I mean, I think that sort of the universe, sadly, we're the universally despised enemy there, and they give themselves something like global stature if they can say, as bin Laden was able to say, I've taken on the most powerful country in the world, and they acknowledge me as an adversary worth fighting. That creates an enormous amount of stature as well as a common enemy. So I think that tactically that's a terrific point, an extremely important point. But then what it's going to come back to, because we are altruistic people, many of us who want to do the right thing. What do we do? What do we ask our government to do? I in a commentary earlier, I said that I thought that multi-party solutions were much more appropriate in this situation, that we should be trying to convene regional talks maybe, or bring in multiple parties to address this issue. Certainly we've withdrawn support for the last government in Iraq, but the Maliki government. But what should people be wanting their country to do in a case like this?
Well, this is one area where I think the Obama administration's done some things right, and they've got some more things that they need to do. So they have tried to have some more regional conversations. They've been talking to parties in the neighborhood, like Turkey, like Saudi Arabia, like the Gulf states, like Jordan. These are countries that have a deeply vested interest in what's going on, and at times they've been incredibly counterproductive, to the point that even some of them, there's allegations that they were supporting ISIS. They were, supplying weapons and supplying funds. Less so now, but in the early days. But having those parties at the conversation, and that includes the Iranians, for example. We tried to have a peace process for Syria, which didn't acknowledge that the Iranians had a voice in the debate. Well, that's a recipe for failure. That would be like the British trying to have a peace agreement between the Irish and the British without involving the Irish. You can't do it. They're part of the conversation. They're part of what's going on. But there's a role here for the United Nations that we haven't fully explored. We have the United Nations for situations like this. We haven't taken this issue to the United Nations. If there is a need for military action at some point, and there may be at some point, then there's a role for the world to come together because everyone agrees on the fundamentals of what needs to be done and say, we should do that. We haven't seen that fully pursued. It needs to be fully pursued. And the last thing is, there's a tremendous amount of suffering that will be alleviated, not with bombs, but with food, water, shelter, and supplies. One of the things that I was very heartened to see my government do was people were dying on a mountain, starving and dying of thirst. We gave them food and water. That's an amazing thing, and that saved several thousand lives, and we should be proud of that. There's many more lives that need to be saved, not through any sort of military action, but just on the basic needs of food and water. The UN just confirmed that kind of the humanitarian crisis just from the Syrian conflict alone with 3 million refugees is something that just has never existed on this scale for this long. There's tremendous need, and the U.S. should lead the world and live our values. We've been doing a good job, but we need to keep doing it. We need to take care of that humanitarian crisis by providing for those basic fundamental needs.
Well, that sounds like a great approach to a tragic and situation that will take a long time to heal, but emphasize humanitarian actions and the role of the United Nations. So thanks for discussing this tragic situation with us, Stephen Miles, Advocacy Director for Win Without War. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Have a good weekend.
You too. We'll be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour. And we are back on the Zero Hour. In that last segment, we talked about how news stories affected our perception of global situations and war situations. But, they affect our perceptions at home, of course. And at a time when we're facing the militarization of the police force and incidents like the ones in Ferguson, shootings that we've been covering heavily here on the Zero Hour, it's important to look at how our media covers our cities. Joining us now is Todd Gregory, who is the editor at Media Matters for America. Media Matters has just issued a report which Todd co-wrote on the coverage of crime in New York City by television stations and the disproportionate emphasis on African-American crime. Todd, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So listen, your new report it states that your Media Matters analysis found that 4 major broadcast television stations in New York City gave disproportionate coverage to crime stories involving African American suspects over the past 3 months. How did you conclude that, and why do you think that is?
So what we did was we watched 12 weeks worth of late night news broadcasts. You know, the 11 o'clock shows on ABC, NBC, and CBS, the affiliates, and well, actually the flagship stations of the networks in New York, and WNYW, which is the Fox station in New York, and watched those 11 o'clock and the 10 o'clock show on Fox, and did a count up of all the crime stories that they covered. There were, a few affiliated categories, but the vast majority of the crime stories that they covered fell into three big categories: murders, thefts, and assaults. And what we did was we looked at all the reports, and inside those reports on those different crime categories, we looked at whether or not you could tell from watching the report if the race of the suspects involved was identified, whether through a picture shown on the air or if it was explicitly stated in the report. So we counted those up. We went and counted up all the crime reports, the number of suspects in those reports that could be identified by their race, and then the number of those people who were African American. And so we had those numbers for these 12 weeks. It was from late May into, I think, mid-August. And we compared that to data that we got from New York City Police Department statistics. So every year the New York City Police Department releases a crime report, and it has total numbers in it, and inside those total numbers, they break down the number of, I think the categories are, suspects. They break down suspects by race. They do it by race, or I'm sorry, by suspect, and then they also do it by arrests. So we thought the more sort of accurate representation of how who was arrested for these crimes, according to the New York Police Department, it would be smartest to compare the suspects shown on TV and compare that to the data for the arrests in those different crime categories. The way that we did it, the way we found the historical data, we used four years of stats from the NYPD and averaged those out to get a sense of how frequently African Americans were arrested in these 3 different crime categories, and then we compared.
So you looked at the. Let me just jump in. So you looked at the percentage, and presumably the percentage of African Americans didn't rise dramatically over those 4 years. So you got a rough idea, and then you identified the race where it was identifiable on news stories, and what you found, you're saying, is that there was much more. There was notably more reporting of African American major crime, meaning murders and theft and so on television than there was in the police statistics. Is that right?
That's right. This is so to be clear. This is from 3 months this summer versus a kind of a historical average from NYPD data, but. The sort of the percentages in the historical data were pretty consistent. So we're, pretty, unless there was some inexplicable spike in the number of African Americans committing these kinds of crimes in 3 months this summer, the numbers should be pretty consistent. So what we found was that in the NYPD data, in murders, African Americans were arrested 54% of the time. In reports during these 3 months on New York City news broadcasts at 11 o'clock, 68% of the suspects that they reported on were African American. For thefts, it was 55 in the crime data and 80 on TV. For assaults, it was 49 in the crime data and 72% on TV. So, there's a real gap there. There is a disparity between sort of the historical arrest rates for African Americans in these crime categories and the way that sort of the aggregate number of reports that are being shown on TV. So that's
sure. And I think your point, or what one could conclude from this report is that people watching local news in New York City would get a distorted picture of the criminality of the African American population and of how much crime is actually committed by African Americans in that city, which could significantly affect their social views, their political views, and views on law enforcement and so on. And law enforcement, of course, is a very hot topic in New York City these days. So I guess my next question for you would be, do you guys have any theories about why that might be, that there's such disproportionate reporting? Are the police behind this? Are they only identifying African American suspects? Do the reporters think they're more hotter stories, or do we just not know?
See, that we don't know. I mean, I have some ideas. You brought up some good factors some of which I hadn't even thought about. That's an open question, and I think that's the important thing to take away from this report for people who work, not to be clear, not just in TV news, but in all sort of all kinds of media, is to be aware of the bigger picture that their reporting is painting. And like you said, that has some obvious, or would suggest that it has some obvious effects on the way people think about policy, the way they think about politics, and the way they think about their neighbors even. So I think that the thing that I think is important, like I said, is for media people to think about this and realize that even though from a media perspective, even though you might think that individually the judgments that you're making about what stories to cover and how to cover them, even though maybe you'd like to think as someone who works in the media that you're not letting race influence those individual decisions, you still need to be aware of the bigger picture that's created by your coverage, and you need to think about finding if this is consistently happening, if your coverage is consistently out of proportion to the reality on the ground in whatever area you're covering. You need to find a way to fix that. You need to find a way inside your own organization to make sure that there are checks in place to make sure that you're not giving your viewers a distorted picture of crime and race.
Well, I think that's really important. Of course, you guys at Media Matters for America are always, you monitor the media, and I think it is important for media professionals to keep this in mind. Look, whether it's an unconscious bias on their part or whether they're merely reporting the information as it's given to them by the police, or there are other factors involved maybe that we can't think of, still, as a journalist, it's important for one, and I consider myself a journalist as well as a commentator, it's important to make sure you're giving people as accurate a view of the facts as opposed to your opinions as you can. So these implications run very, very deep. So any plans to look at this issue any further, either in New York City or in other markets?
I think there are some plans to continue to keep an eye on this in sort of different formats. We'll see how it works out.
All right. Well, please keep us posted on your progress. I do think it's important whether this, as I say, whether the bias is coming from police reporting or journalistic reporting. I think we need to get out. Well, and I think I would say the other moral is New Yorkers now have to realize they have to be afraid of white people too. But the real message, I think, is that the impression we're getting, maybe not just in New York City either, about our communities and the people in them may be distorted, and that before we jump to conclusions, we should think twice. And if we're in the media profession, we should be very careful about being responsible to all the communities we serve. So thanks so much for your good work. Thanks so much for coming on the show and talking to us about this. Todd Gregory, editor at Media Matters for America.
Thanks so much.
You bet. All right, so that's our report for this week. Horror in the Middle East, biased reporting in New York City, an economy filled with distortions, a need to restore the union movement, and of course, sex with robots. We'll have an equally interesting program. At least we hope you find it interesting next week. I hope you come back and listen to us. I am Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.